Greetings, parasite ecologists. In this video, we're going to take our first deep dive into a group of parasites, the trematodes. The trematodes are a class within the phylum Platyhelminthes, which is the phylum that contains all of the flatworms. The term Platyhelminthes means flatworm in Latin. But the trematodes are not the only class that we'll study within the Platyhelminthes. So let's start by getting ourselves situated within this very cool phylum of worms. Among the flatworms, the most basal clade are the Turbellaria, which is composed of mostly free-living species. A few species within the Turbellaria are commensals. They live in or on host organisms, but they don't cause any change in host fitness. Common places to find commensal turbellarians are on sea cucumbers, sea urchins, or hanging onto the carapace of crustaceans. One of the cool things about the turbellarians is they probably look a lot like the very earliest parasitic flatworms. That is to say, monogenes, trematodes, and cestodes probably evolved from a turbellarian-like ancestor. And you can imagine how you could evolve from living on your own to hanging out on a sea cucumber, to hanging out on a sea cucumber and taking maybe a couple bites of your host, to being a full-blown parasite. Once we move beyond the turbellarians, we get to the flatworm groups that are entirely parasitic, including the monogenes, the trematodes, and the cestodes. Let's zoom in on the trematodes. Trematodes are everywhere. In fact, there's probably a trematode within a couple of feet of you right now. It's hard to estimate the total diversity of any group of parasites because less than 10% of parasite species have been formally described. So most parasites out there have probably never even received their scientific name. But just for the trematode parasites alone, it is estimated that there are 44,262 species. This is probably an underestimate, and there are probably more trematode species than this out in the world. But until we get more people out there discovering new species and naming them, we won't know for sure. What we do know for sure is that there are plenty of species of trematodes. Of the ones that have been described, a handful are important human parasites. Of course, those are the ones that we know the most about their ecology, life cycles, and biology. So we're going to talk about a number of human-infecting trematode parasites in the following videos. But before we get there, let's talk about the generic trematode life cycle. One of the coolest things about trematodes is that they have these complex life cycles, meaning life cycles that use multiple species of hosts. If a parasite can transmit from one host to another host of the same species, we call that direct transmission. And that's not what the trematodes are about. Trematodes are all about the complex life cycle, where they pass from one host to another host of a different species, usually in a specific sequence. The trematodes are not the only group of parasites that have complex life cycles, but they do the complex life cycle thing very well. Although the exact pattern of the complex life cycle can vary from one trematode species to the next, most species have a 3-host life cycle, meaning a life cycle that includes 3 different host species. Each host species sustains a different life stage for the parasite. This is a pretty stereotypical trematode life cycle. This life cycle diagram describes a real trematode called Euhaplorchis californiensis, which has a pretty prototypical trematode life cycle. One thing to notice is that there are a couple of different kinds of hosts in this life cycle. We always reserve the term definitive host for the host in which sexual reproduction takes place. And typically there's only one stage in the life cycle where sexual reproduction takes place. But there can be multiple places where asexual reproduction takes place, or where the larva just kind of hangs out for a while. And we call those hosts, the hosts of those stages, intermediate hosts. The first intermediate host is the first one downstream of the definitive host in the life cycle. And the second intermediate host is the next one after that. So let's jump into the Euhaplorchis californiensis life cycle and get a sense of how trematode life cycles work. Every trematode begins its life in the intestine of a vertebrate, and inside the intestine, the adult worms mate with one another. They sexually reproduce, produce eggs, and those eggs are released from the body of the definitive host, in this case it's a bird, out into the environment. The eggs contain a little larva, and they're protected by a resilient shell. That's what is passed out with the poop of the definitive host. In the case of Euhaplorchis californiensis, the bird host is typically a shorebird, and it'll defecate, for example, in a salt marsh, which is exactly what the parasite wants. When this egg is pooped into a salt marsh, the larva inside senses that the conditions are just right, and it bursts out of its egg. At that stage, it becomes a myristidium, which is a ciliated larval stage that kind of trucks around in the intertidal zone. It's mobile, skims around in the thin sheen of water on the mud, looking for a first intermediate snail host to infect. When it finds that first intermediate snail host, it'll penetrate into the host and wend its way up into the visceral hump of the snail, which is the part of the body that's up in the spire of the shell. Once it's there, the parasite will asexually produce structures called parthenidae. Parthenidae is an umbrella term because there are actually two kinds of parthenidae, sporocysts or rhedia. Each trematode species produces one kind of parthenidae, either sporocysts or rhedia. The difference between these two is that sporocysts have no pharynx, whereas the rhedia do have a pharynx. These structures are really weird and hard to wrap your mind around. Sporocysts and rhedia are just sacs in which the next larval stage of the parasite asexually develops. Each sac, each sporocyst or rhedia, contains a bunch of little developing cercariae, which are the next stage in the life cycle of the parasite. But it gets even weirder because in addition to incubating these developing cercariae, the sporocysts and rhedia also move around. And in the case of the rhediae, they have a pharynx, so they feed as well, munching on snail gonads and snail digestive tissues. The sporocyst, lacking a mouth and a pharynx, just absorbs the host snail's nutrients across its body wall. This larval stage of the trematodes is called a parasitic castrator, which means that when the poor host, like this sad little California horn snail, when it becomes infected, bad things happen to it. This is what a healthy snail looks like. The visceral hump is this section on the left, the spirally part. Normally, that spiral is up in the spire of the shell, but this particular snail had its shell removed with the hammer, so you can see all of the soft tissue underneath. And you can see in this uninfected snail that the visceral hump has some nice, healthy green and orange-looking tissue, maybe a little bit of blue. That's what a healthy snail looks like. An infected snail, a snail that's infected with trematode parasites, instead looks like this. The visceral hump is white or gray, and there's all these little sausage-shaped things that are kind of spilling out of it. And those sausage-shaped things are the parthenidae, either sporocysts or rhedia of the trematode. What these guys have done is literally eat the gonad of the snail, along with some of its digestive tissue, and they've turned all of that snail reproductive biomass into parasite biomass instead. The trematodes, in this way, totally block snail reproduction, and those parasitically castrated hosts become the living dead. They're zombies. They're never again going to produce snail babies, but they will be alive. They'll move around in the intertidal zone. They'll eat. They might even mate with other snails, but they're never going to produce their own offspring. They will only, for the rest of their lives, pump out parasite larvae. And that's why we call them the living dead. And if you think asexually produced bags of parasites eating snail gonads is weird, just wait. Because it also turns out those bags, those parthenidae, have social organization, just like an ant colony. I'll see you in the next video.